Well, I began with the idea because when the Oklahoma bombing took place, I was in Washington, D.C. with my daughter. And of course, we didn't have any idea that that Oklahoma bombing was going to be limited to Oklahoma. We thought maybe something bad was going to happen in Washington, D.C. So I called her dad, who was an American historian specializing in the Midwest, to tell him that we were fine and that everything was fine in Washington as far as we knew. And I said, you know, this is as we found out more about the Oklahoma bombing, I said, this is really interesting, this whole idea that the American right wing would actually do this terrible thing, and to the government's buildings and to the people in the buildings. And I said, there must be some precedent. I knew some precedent. And he said, first word out of his mouth was Kansas. And because I grew up in St. Louis, I did know something about the history of the Civil War before and after in Missouri, and I vaguely knew about Bleeding Kansas, but I didn't know that it was as interesting as it was. So I started reading, and I read a book or two, I can't remember which ones, but the really important thing for a researcher about Bleeding Kansas is that it took place during an election year. So all kinds of newspapers, even from Europe, sent correspondence to Lawrence to write articles about it. So there was a huge amount of primary source material from the newspapers. There was also a lot of primary source material from settlers on both sides. One of the things that happened in Kansas, as always happened in America in those days, was flyers would be put out saying what a paradise this new area for settlement was, and people would be lured there. And even in Illinois, you didn't know that maybe the paradise did not match up to what the flyers said. But it was a property scam, you know. We all know what those are. So, so there were also books that were written by people who went out there, say from Massachusetts or other places in the East, Ohio, lost everything. Some of them were very, very sad, and then went back home to wherever they came from and wrote a book about their experiences, partly to recoup some of their losses. I think one thing that gets into the All True Travels and Adventures of Lidie Newton is how horrifying some of those experiences were. Young boys would go out there looking for adventure. They would come down with malaria or cholera. They would die without even being able to say who they were, where they were from, and the people who nursed them in their last days wouldn't be able to contact the relatives because they didn't know who the relatives were. That was an important thing for me to understand how far away they really were. Even if they were only, say, 400 miles from Illinois, they were really, really far away in terms of communication, in terms of people knowing what was going on with them. The roads in Missouri were very bad, so there was one man that I remember writing about his child dying, and he had to carry the body through the roads in Missouri for several weeks before he could find a place to actually bury the child. And so the horrors of not just what happened in Lawrence, but the whole world that Lawrence was a part of kind of are amazing to the modern mind. And I wanted to get some of that into Lidie Newton also. Well, the Kansas-Missouri War was a guerrilla war. It involved neighbors sort of saying hi and being friendly during the day and then attacking at night. And this happened from the beginning all the way through the Civil War, and then subsequent gangs of outlaws could also call themselves insurgents, you know, or leftover freedom fighters. especially in Missouri. So the James Gang was an example of that. They were leftover Southern sympathizers from the Civil War. They did not see anything wrong with robbing the establishment and taking the money, robbing the banks. I think they robbed banks, not trains. So people in Missouri were very, and Kansas too, were very aware that the old enmities were long. They didn't easily die. They were deeply felt, and they were acted upon in a kind of individualized way. The war in the East was much more formal, with soldiers lining up and having battles. As the war continued, it devolved in various places into a more guerrilla type war. But the real guerrilla war was in Kansas and Missouri. And one of the things I felt after writing Lidie Newton was that the Civil War began in 1856. It was suppressed, but it began in the West in 1856, was suppressed well enough by the Buchanan administration with the help of Mr. Gary, who had suppressed the vigilantes out in San Francisco. But there was no chance that it was not going to explode. But it had to go to the East in order to explode, and that's what John Brown did. He tried to start it in Kansas, did not succeed. It was too far from the center. But then he managed to get to Harper's Ferry and started there. Well, historical fiction or a historical novel is really about a regular person caught up in history. You see historical plays, for example, and they have kings in them. But historical novels almost always have obscure people who happen to meet the king. And some writers of historical fiction play around for dramatic reasons with the facts, and some writers don't. For my purposes, the historical fictions that I've chosen to do, which would be Lidie Newton, The Greenlanders, and Private Life, my newest novel, the facts are plenty dramatic. There's no need to play around with them. All you have to do is get them in order and get your person in there. I did feel for something like the Kansas events, I had to be as accurate as possible because the record is there. For something like the Greenlanders, the record is pretty small. It's manageable and interesting, but you have to make up a lot of stuff. But for the Kansas events, you don't have to make up anything. It's already there right in front of you. Now, even Lidie comes from a person I read about in one of the narratives. Somebody comes across a woman riding a horse, and she has very long hair. She's a good rider, and she's sort of mysterious. And I thought, oh, that's the girl I want. But she's nameless. She only appears one time. She just happens to interest this person who's writing the narrative. But I don't, you can play with the facts, but if all the facts are known, you can't play with them. Well, you don't know until you've already written the first draft. And then you start leaving things out that are, say, less important or a little distracting or repetitious. And even then, you can't ever say, oh, absolutely, I was right in leaving that out. I don't think you can leave out sort of the moral arguments that are made by both sides. And that's why Lidie Newton has a Lawrence side and a Missouri side, because once Lidie's, at the end of the first half, when Lidie's husband is killed, she goes on a sort of revenge trek into Missouri, thinking that maybe she'll find the killers. She has a few clues about who the killers are. But she collapses for various reasons and is rescued by some people who own a big property in Missouri. And then that gives her the opportunity to hear the side of the Missourians. And they have a side too. So I think it's really important when you're writing about a conflict to honestly portray each side as they themselves felt it, whether the modern world feels the same or not. And so that's one of the things that I tried to do. When she goes into Missouri, she meets people from Missouri. When those people from Missouri express their opinions, they express it in their own voices, in the dialogue. And then she meets one of the slaves belonging to the man whose family rescues her, and she expresses her side of her opinion too. And then Lidie kind of expresses the disorientation that all of this has given her. When she comes home from Kansas, she's a modern woman. She's modern in a lot of ways, and she does not feel comfortable anymore in the world of pre-war, mid-19th century. She has been projected forward into the world of guerrilla war, the world of competing antipathies, the world of competing empathies, the world of, let's say, not knowing exactly what is right and what should be done in the traditional way. So she's quite disoriented when she comes home.